everyone, Karen the Warp Spinster here. Welcome to my channel. If this is your first time, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. I'm going to be continuing with ideas for 2.5-inch squares. I have a lot of them. Thank you for all of your comments about the 2.5-inch square projects. It's been a lot of fun to read them and good to see what everyone's been doing with 2.5-inch squares. So today, this is another one that's in my head. I don't know how it's going to turn out in reality, but I'm planning to use the squares. I'll create a piece of fabric, pieced fabric with these, just sewing them all together into a fabric because, you know, cutting and then sewing together is what we do. And then I'm going to use that as the background for a block. Now, I'm going to be using the Friendship Star because, first of all, it's my favorite quilt block, and second, because it's fairly simple. I can try this out without a lot of foo-for-ah nonsense going on here. We have to start out with a little bit of math first to figure out how large a piece of fabric we have to put together here. And then I'm going to be using a light gray, kind of a taupey gray, to go with it for the star points. So the Friendship Star, just to review it if you aren't familiar with it, is basically a 9-patch. And it just has half square triangles. I have to think about these so I get them oriented correctly. You'd think after I'd made 10,000 of these, I'd be an expert at it. And then that gets filled in. So basically, these pieces that are just shown as background here are going to be those. Now, these are 2-inch squares, and when I cut the fabric made from these, I don't want to be cutting on the seam line. If that's clear. I want to have the pieces larger so that this piece isn't 2 inches square, which I might as well just use a 2-inch square here, but will be larger so that it will have pieced bits in it. So I'm going to go for at least making these pieces based on 3 inches, maybe 4. If I do 4, then that means I need to cut squares that are 4.5 and 5. Let's go with that. I think we'll get a little more variation in the background. And this concept, of course, could be used for any scraps that you put together. I have some 1.5-inch squares down there I should use one of these days. I am using them. It's just taking years. So that means if these are 4-inch squares, this is going to be a 12-inch block finished. And I will need these to be 4.5 inches. So I will need 4.5-inch squares of the background. And then 2 5-inch squares of the background. And that's because when I'm doing half square triangles, this is the way I do it. Typically, there are lots of ways you can do it, but I like to make them a little oversized and then cut them down to size. So the standard for doing the half square triangles is to cut 2 squares, same size. You draw a line diagonally there and then sew a 1/4 inch, scant 1/4 inch on either side, unfold those, and then you have the 2 half square triangles. You can also, so I cut these, if 4 inches is my finished size, I'm going to add 1 inch to what my finished size is, and that's the size I'm going to cut these squares. If you don't want to do the whole squaring up thing, then you add 7/8 inches to the finished size. So instead of two 4.5-inch squares, you're going to cut two 4 7/8 squares, one of the background and one of the star point. But I like to have half square triangles that are really accurate, so I just up it a little bit and then trim it. So long way of saying, that's why I need two 5-inch squares, and it's only two because each of these yields two half square triangles. So those will be folded up. Okay, you all know how half square triangles work. And then, so that's of the background fabric. And then the square point, the blue star points, I'm going to need the same two 5-inch squares because those get paired up with the background 5-inch squares. And then I'm also going to need one 4.5-inch square for the center. Ooh, but here's an idea. I've got a lot of crumbs left. So what if I did a 4.5-inch square out of crumbs for the center? Might give that a try. All right, all of this was just by way of telling me how many of these I need to put together. And it's not going to actually be that many, but I want to give myself room if, for example, I have a bunch of solids here and snuck in a few prints. So if I have these together, this doesn't have seam allowances, of course, I want to be able to cut a square like this so that it isn't all centered on one of those. So I want to give myself some extra room. And these four together would not even give me a 4.5-inch square. Well, yes, it would. Actually, that would give me exactly a 4.5-inch square, but then I don't think that would be as interesting. You could certainly do it. I just don't think it would be as interesting. So for each 4.5-inch square, I'm going to want at least a 3x3 bit of fabric here. This is an interesting combination of fabrics, isn't it? What else have I got? I don't want a bright green right next to that. Green. I'm a little more picky about what I'm doing here than I am doing in, say, the mystery quilt, because I don't know where those are going to end up being together anyway. And I can put a blue down here and a red here. And I don't know, another green down here perhaps. So I can sew those together and still give myself an interesting 4.5-inch cut out of that. But then I could also start on the next 4.5-inch cut. So I think what I want to do is actually do 5x5. That's my plan. And that will give me probably 4 of those 4.5-inch squares. We're going to try it. If it's wrong, at least I've done it and can tell you that it's wrong, so you won't do it. So I'm going to do a 5x5, put that together, and I'll be back with you. I wanted to come back in for just a minute in the midst of this to describe how I put these things together everywhere from a 4-patch to 600 patch or blocks into quilt tops. Some of you probably already use this method. I don't remember from whom I learned it, to be honest. It was a long time ago, but it's very handy for keeping track of things and saving on thread. So this was my first 2 columns of 5 that I just ran through the machine without cutting the threads. So they would open up like that, and then they're ready for this column. I put a pin in the upper left corner always, so that I know that's the upper left corner, and I'm sure that I'm adding things onto the correct side. Then I'm just going to open these up. I'm leaving them attached. I'm going to open them up, and then I go back to the machine, and as I come to each new square here, I'm just going to flip and sew those on. And then again, I will cut it after I get to the bottom of this column, start adding, etc., etc. Then when they're all together, I can do the rows together. This way, I know how to pick them up if I have to walk away from this or take it with me to a retreat or whatever. Then I know exactly the order that it's in. And if I can get it to the point where the columns are all joined together, then I can easily pack it up because they're already joined, so I know how to sew the rows together. Okay, I'll finish and be back again. And I apologize if the light gets funky. We're wavering between really heavy cloud cover and blinding sunlight. So I'm doing my best. I hope it's gonna be okay. I lied, I'm back before I finished. Just wanted to show you that now I've got all of those columns sewed together. I haven't cut the threads in between. Now I'm going to press them so all of this row seams go that way or the other way, doesn't matter. And then just alternate the direction that I'm pressing the seams, sew them together, and then we'll move on. I'm back, all pressed, ready to go. This now measures 10.5 inches square, which will be plenty for me to get 4.5 inch squares out of it without cutting right on there. So I can move it around a bit, not maybe a lot, but I can move it around some so that I'm getting, so here's 1, here's 4.5, and here's 4.5 down here. And I want to make sure that I'm not losing any of that difference to seams. All right, so that looks like it could work here. That's going to be 5.5 inches from here, which will still give me enough over here. All right, so now I'm going to line up this line here. Maybe I'll move it a little bit over and make a cut. I suppose a good thing to do actually would be to cut this roughly in half first, which is essentially what I'm doing here. All right, I'm just muttering to myself. You know, talk amongst yourselves if my nonsense is driving you crazy. All right, that will be enough for both sides. And now I can cut this to give me a 4.5 inch square wherever I might like it. Don't want to cut any more off of there, so it will come off this end because I want bits and pieces of these 2.5 inch squares. I don't really want any 2.5 inch square in there. So 4.5 would be here, and round about there. So now I'm going to, can't turn my mat, all right. I have my mat stuck down so that I know exactly where the frame is, camera frame is. If I want this to be 4.5 here, want to give it enough room over here, then I'm going to cut this right here and then trim this to 4.5. There's 4.5, that's 5, 4.5. Now, lest you freak out that I am creating all this waste, never fear. I can use it in my crumb pile. In fact, I might use that in the center. So there's one of my background squares. Let's do this one, 4.5, 4.5. And go ahead and use however your brain wants to do this. I'm just letting you into my wild brain machinations. And there's another one. Now, of course, I could also do this so that these are the, thank Karen, the star points, the star instead of the background. And I still need to do 2 5-inch squares, which I will do just the same way. Oh no, I don't need to. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I'm used to this being the main fabric, so it would be the star points, and I don't know. Simply put, my head is just whatever. Let's go here for 4.5, 4.5 about there. Another bit for the crumbs pile, and now I could actually do one of the 5-inchers from here, because I'm going to have to do another piece of fabric anyway. And let me do one of the 5s here. There we go. I'm sitting down trying to cut, which is always a challenge for me. So now I have 3 of my 4.5-inch blocks and 1 of my 5. So I'm just going to repeat that process with 25 more squares, another 5 by 5, and should be able to cut the rest from that. I shall be back when I have got that sheet together. I'm back, and with a lesson learned that I figured out while I was sewing. Actually, I sort of figured it out when I was cutting the last one. Because these measure 10.5 inches, if I need 5-inch squares, of course I have much less room for trimming so that I don't have so many complete 2-inch finished squares in there. I could have, when I was doing the 4.5-inch squares, I could have done just 4.5 and 5 across, and that would have given me a little more room instead of having to do 2 5s across. I can still do it. I need just 1 more 5-inch and 1 more 4.5-inch. So that gives me plenty left here. Actually, the second set, I could have done a smaller set here, but if I were to do another block, for example, then this would give me a head start on the next block. So I need 1 more 5-inch and 1 more 4.5-inch. So I'm going to take 1 from the bottom here and 1 from the top there, just so they're, I guess that really won't be much different. I'm mumbling, just talk amongst yourselves and ignore me. All right, this is going to be a 5-incher. So I'll give it about like that. Trim it to 5. And, okay, so now I have my 2 5-inch, which will be for the points. I didn't finish trimming that one. So here's, thought that didn't look quite right. There are my 2 5-inches. Those are too little even for a crumb quilt. And then I just need no, I'm gonna leave this intact for the next block. And this one I will trim to 4.5 for my other corner piece on the friendship star. The friendship star and I are old friends. First of all, I love the pattern, but that was also my basis for a lot of the alterations, I guess, block riffs I did in one of my classes, a couple of my classes, and so I've gotten to know it quite well. Still love it. So here are my pieces cut for the background. Now I'm going to cut my star bit, which will be for the 4 points. I'm going to do 2 5-inch squares that will be paired up with this. So I will do that and come back. If I didn't want to do crumb quilting in the middle, then I would also cut a 4.5-inch square of my star point fabric. So I will do that and come back. Now I have drawn a diagonal line, just a pencil line from corner to corner on the wrong side of my star point fabric, this light gray that I'm doing, and placing it then right sides together with my 5-inch squares. And I put a couple of pins in just to keep it from shifting while I do the stitching. And now I'll stitch a scant 1/4 inch on both sides of those lines. And now I'll be able to cut on that drawn line. When I fold this back, there's my half square triangle unit, and then with each pair of squares, you get a pair of half square triangles. Then I'll press it and trim it, square it up to 4.5 inches. I will use the Block Lock half square triangle ruler in order to do that. If you want to see how I go about that, you can check out my video on my 5 favorite rulers, and I've probably used it in other videos as well, but I will try to remember to link to the 5 favorite rulers in the description below. And I'm back with my half square triangles all squared up. One thing that I did do at first, I thought I was going to press toward the pieced background, but that was going to create a lot of bulk in some places, such as right here where I'm folding back against a 4-corner point there. That's a lot of bulk. Even if I press it open, that's still a lot of bulk. And secondly, I like to have the star lift up a little bit from the quilt, and visually that happens more for me, and in my mind anyway, that if I press it toward the piece that I want to emphasize more, that will visually lift it up off the quilt a little bit. So I decided to press it toward the star points, but to prevent some of that shadowing through, because this is still a fairly, I mean, it's a good quality fabric, but it's lighter than most of my background fabric, so it could shadow through. So I just went through and cut a sliver, just a sliver off that side of the seam, so that those colors aren't going to shadow through. It's not perfect, but it gives the effect that I want. So I'm doing it that way. If you had a darker fabric, say lighter fabrics out here and a darker one in there, then you would have no problem. You wouldn't have to trim the one side of the seam. So I am going to now start to lay this out in the form here, and I'm having, frankly, second thoughts about doing the center as crumbs. And I'll talk about why in a minute here. I have to make sure that I can get these turning. Honestly, I've made, I don't know how many thousands of these things, and I always have to check what I'm doing. That can't possibly work, Karen. There we go. Nope. There we are. All right, so there are my star points. Here are my corners. I don't know how much of this you're getting on camera. Let me pull it up a bit here. Sorry to make you dizzy and disoriented. See most of it now anyway. And I like that effect. My fear, this isn't right yet. You were calling to me, weren't you, saying, no, Karen, it's wrong. I fear that if I put crumb pieces in here, that I'm going to lose the star. That it's going to look like there's a hole in the middle of the star. So I'm rethinking that and thinking that I do want this gray in the center. Kind of hurts my heart a little because I like the idea of the crumbs in the middle, but I just don't think that's going to work. So I'm going to cut a 4.5 inch square out of my gray and then just sew this together like a 9 patch. Here's the finished block. I like it. It's not a typical modern quilt sort of look. It's very busy, but I like it for its own sake. I'm glad I decided not to do the crumb in the center, and I'm thinking about how you might make this less busy if you decided to do that. You could alternate having this as the background and having it as the star. So every other block will rest the eye on the background and then alternating resting the eye on the star. You could also just reverse it for the whole quilt, and then you've got the busy stuff happening in the star of the block. I think this could also make a fun kids quilt. Again, I might think about alternating the background and the star fabric. You could do sashing in between. But I like the concept because, and it would be interesting to see it in more traditional fabrics, darker fabrics here. And then maybe a almost solid, reed solid fabric here. I don't know, I think something more like Kansas Treble sorts of colors, not really Civil War maybe. Anyway, more traditional fabrics out here. What else might you do? You could also alternate, maybe do it on point. I don't know how I feel about that star on point. That's kind of interesting. It's a different kind of look. And alternate with plain blocks. Of course, you could do that with straight on as well, with blocks that match this. Of course, you can always use different colors for the stars in the center. It was an interesting exercise. I'm glad that I did it, and I would think about how I might work this into a quilt. It might be kind of fun to do a sampler where it doesn't have to be all stars, but do the background with the same process and then use different blocks. So do a friendship star and, I don't know, an Ohio star. Probably more simple blocks, because if you start cutting these into little pieces, then you're going to really end up with some, I think, possibly less manageable pieces when you start cutting those into smaller bits. So that was my exercise for the day. It turned out sort of like I had pictured it in my head, but not exactly. And it's always good to experiment, try things out, see what you think. Let me know in the comments what you would do with this, how you might do it differently, or how you might put together a multitude of these blocks. That's it for today. If you enjoyed the video or found a bit of interest or inspiration in it, please give it a thumbs up. I'll try to remember to link some things in the description. Do better than I did on the last video. And I will see you next time. In the meantime, be well, be happy, be quilting. Peace out.